The sun was cruel that morning. It had no business shining on a thing like this. Heat shimmered off the dirt road, where boots scuffed and dust clung to the hems of judgment. And in the center of it all, a line of children, lined up like livestock along the worn wood of the auction block, their shadows sharp and long against the boards. The town of Marabone stood still, watching. And at the far end of the line, there was a girl, no more than 5, hair a tangled mess of straw, chin lifted even though her cheeks were hollow. She held tight to a smaller hand, a hand belonging to her 3-year-old sister who couldn't stop crying. The little one had no shoes. Her dress, once pink, was now the color of ditch water. She kept calling for her mama, a word that just dissolved into the hot, empty air. Only the older girl answered, brushing dirt from her sister's cheek with a thumb raw from blisters. The auctioneer cleared his throat, a sound like a man about to swallow poison. "Next lot," he called out, his voice scraping the silence. 2 healthy girls, no known disease, can carry buckets or mind a porch." But the girls didn't step forward. They were shoved. A sharp-nosed woman in a cornflower blue bonnet stood behind them, her arms crossed, her mouth a thin, angry line. She wasn't blood, just kin by a marriage long dead. "Don't let their size fool you," she spat. "The older one's stubborn, but she learns fast. The little one don't talk much, only to her." The auctioneer motioned for them to turn around. The older one obeyed, her movements stiff. The younger one just buried her face against her sister's leg and sobbed even harder. "She's not ready," the older girl said, her voice dry as gravel. "She's only 3. The words hung in the air, thick as smoke from a burned-out house. A man in a brown vest stepped forward. He looked like a butcher, with thick hands and a wide belt that strained at his middle. "I'll take the big one," he grunted. "Got steps that need scrubbing. Don't need the crybaby." But that wasn't going to happen. "She stays with me," the older girl said, her grip tightening on her sister's tiny wrist. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but not from the butcher, and not from the woman in the bonnet. "Don't you talk back," the woman hissed. She yanked the 3-year-old's arm, shoving her toward the man. The little girl stumbled, her bare knees scraping across the splintered platform. For a single, terrible heartbeat, the crying stopped. Then it returned, sharp and panicked. The older girl didn't hesitate. She ran, kneeling beside her sister, wrapping her little arms around that small, trembling body, as if she could hide her beneath her own ribs. "Don't take her," she pleaded again, her voice cracking. "She's only 3. The crowd shifted, restless now. Some folks turned away, unable to watch. Others leaned in, waiting to see who would break first, and that's when he stepped forward. He came from the side, quiet as a shadow. It was as if he'd just appeared, or maybe he'd been standing in the shade all along, watching. His boots were worn. His shirt, once white, was now the color of old snow. He was tall, with shoulders that still held the memory of heavy labor. A rancher, some whispered. Widowed. A man who never came to town unless he had to. He didn't say a word. He just knelt, one knee in the dust, and gathered the little girl from the ground. She didn't fight him. Her face pressed into his collarbone, and her sobs just folded into silence. The older girl stared, her mouth open, her hands still hanging in the air where her sister had been just a moment before. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. "You bidding, sir?" The man reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out 2 silver coins and let them fall into the dust. No ceremony, no sound, but a soft thud. "That covers 1," the sharp-nosed woman snapped. "You want the older, that's more." The man didn't even blink. He looked at the older girl, who stood trembling but silent. Then he looked back at the child in his arms. She'd already gone limp against him, as if her whole weight, her whole trust, had been given over in an instant. "Both," he said. His voice was low, but it moved through the crowd like distant thunder. You couldn't place it, but you could feel it in your bones. The woman scoffed. "I won't lose coin just because you're sentimental." He reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded cloth pouch. He opened it. It was full of silver, more than enough to buy a wagon and a team of horses. He laid the pouch in the dust next to the coins. Then he turned and walked away before anyone could argue. The older girl stepped down from the block on her own. Her legs wobbled, but she didn't fall. He didn't offer her a hand. She didn't ask for one. They walked through the hush of the crowd, a strange little procession of three, past the church fence and the dry water trough, past the glares and the whispers. The sun beat down on them, but for the first time that day, it didn't feel cruel. It just felt warm. They reached the edge of town before the older girl spoke. "What's your name?" she asked, her eyes on the dusty road ahead. The man glanced at her, then back to the horizon. "Hatch," he said. "Is that your first name or your last?" "It's enough." She looked down at the little girl he carried, now fast asleep against his chest. "She has bad dreams," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Wakes up screaming, 'Mama's gone.' I don't think she understands yet." "I know," he said, and the silence that stretched between them after that wasn't empty anymore. It was easy, like thread being pulled slow and steady through soft cloth. The cabin sat at the base of a low ridge, 2 miles out where the dust finally gave way to scrub grass. It wasn't big, but the porch was swept clean, and the windows caught the last light of the day like water catching gold. A single wind chime, made from old spoons, sang a quiet song in the breeze. Inside was clean, too, and sparse. A pot of cooled beans sat on the stove, and 2 carved wooden chairs flanked a small table. He set the youngest girl on the bed, his bed, and tucked a folded blanket around her. She didn't stir. The older girl just stood in the doorway, a small ghost in the fading light. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He handed her a piece of bread. It was dry, but still warm. She ate with both hands, slow but steady, as if she was trying to remember what food tasted like. He pulled the second chair out from the table. She sat. For a long time, the only sound was the soft whistle of the wind through the doorframe and the girl's quiet chewing. "Is this your house?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Your wife died." He nodded again. "Do you want kids?" He didn't answer that one. She studied him, her eyes old and knowing. Then she looked around the room. Her gaze settled on a single coat still hanging on a nail by the door, a woman's coat made of pale blue wool. "I won't touch her things," she said, her voice flat. Then she added something strange. "But she left her smell on that blanket." He glanced at her then, a sharp, sudden movement. "My mama smelled like honey and horses," the girl said, tearing off another bite of bread. "Your wife smells like lavender and clean fire." His shoulders slumped, just slightly, as if that simple truth had snuck under his ribs and found a place to ache. The little one stirred on the bed, and he moved to her side. "She sleeps light," the older girl said, "used to waking up scared. She'll sleep heavy here. That's what Mama used to say." His hand, rough and calloused, brushed the sleeping child's hair. "Then she was a wise woman." A long moment passed. The last of the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the room in shades of orange and purple. The girl leaned back in her chair. "You got a name for her?" "No, she don't talk much yet. Might take a while." "She'll talk when she needs to," the girl said. "She used to sing, when Mama was alive. Then she'll sing again." The girl's eyes blinked heavy. He brought her a second blanket and laid it across her lap. "I ain't scared of you," she said softly, her words almost lost in a yawn. "I know," he said. Outside, the night settled like ash across the hills. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. He stood there for a long time, just watching the two girls sleep, as if he was measuring this new silence, testing to see if it could be trusted. Then he walked to the hearth, fed one more log into the stove, and pulled the door to, just shy of closed. Back in town, the auction block stood empty. The boards were cracked and splintered where the smallest girl had fallen. The crowd was gone, but the memory of that moment, the hush, the coins in the dust, the man who didn't flinch, it lingered. It hung in the air like the smoke of a fire no one had seen lit. And under the blanket in the quiet cabin, the smallest girl, fast asleep, gripped the fabric tight in one hand. Her other hand was open, empty, but turned slightly, as if it was still reaching for someone who was not yet gone. But just before the sun rose the next morning, a single word escaped her lips, the first word she had spoken since being carried off that block. "Papa." And Hatch, standing by the door, froze. Not in fear, but in something much older. Something that felt an awful lot like the beginning of forgiveness. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this quiet act of mercy had just lit a fuse in the town of Marrowbone, and it was burning its way right back to his front door. The cabin didn't talk much, but it knew how to hold a silence. It held it the way a mother holds a crying child, close and without question. The walls were hand-hewn pine, old enough to groan in the wind, but they were solid. The air inside smelled of stove ash, wool, and that faint, lingering scent of lavender. It was the echo of a woman long buried, and it was in everything. Two girls slept under mismatched quilts on the narrow bed. The younger one was curled like a question mark, her thumb near her mouth. The older one lay straight on her back, her eyes wide open, staring at a knot in the ceiling beam as if it held the secrets to the universe. Morning came soft. The sky behind the ridge bled from gold to ivory to a quiet, piercing blue. A rooster called from somewhere past the fence line, and Hatch's boots shuffled across the porch. He didn't open the door. He just set down a basin of warm water, a tin cup of milk, and a slice of buttered cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. Then he walked toward the barn, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The older girl rose slowly, every muscle in her small body aching from the days before, from the dirt road, from a hunger that went deeper than her belly. She moved to the door and cracked it open. The air was cold, but it was clean. She picked up the basin, carried it inside, and gently washed her sister's feet with the cloth. The little one whimpered in her sleep, then settled again. Her lips were cracked, her nails caked with grime. She smelled like old sorrow. The older girl sat with her back against the wall and ate half the cornbread. She tucked the rest under her sister's pillow for later. That night, Hatch brought a second blanket into their room. No words were exchanged. The next day, he brought another. On the third day, the older girl finally broke the silence. "Why do you live alone?" she asked. He was on the porch, cleaning mud from his boots with a stiff brush. He didn't look up. "I don't." "You did before." "Yes." She sat beside him, her small feet swinging over the edge of the porch. "What was her name?" He didn't answer. He just kept scrubbing, the bristles making a sound like grasshopper wings in the dry heat. "She left this place gentle," the girl whispered. "Not everyone gets that." He paused his scrubbing. "How do you know?" "She folded her apron before she went," the girl said, her voice matter of fact. "That's what Mama used to say. Women who fold their aprons, they mean to come back, or they loved what they were leaving behind." He looked at her then, a long, full look that seemed to take in everything about her. "What was your mama like?" he asked, his voice low. "Brave," she said instantly. "And real. She'd braid our hair even when her hands were shaking from the fever. She kept a tin of sugar hidden under the floorboards. Said, 'Life needs sweetness, even when it don't earn it.'" Hatch turned away, blinking slow against the bright sun. Just then, the little one toddled out, barefoot, her blanket trailing behind her like a royal train. She stood in the doorway, squinting at the light. When a gust of wind blew, she shivered, but she didn't cry. She just padded over and sat beside her sister, pulling the blanket around both of them. That night, Hatch laid 2 new pillows on their bed. They were small, made by hand. The stitching was uneven, but it was careful. The girls didn't say thank you. They just slept deeper than they had in a long, long time. And then, on the 4th morning, the dog came. No collar, no sound. It just appeared on the porch like it had been there all along. It had a ragged coat, ribs like fence posts, and one ear that was permanently bent sideways. It sniffed the air, then curled up beside the woodpile and closed its eyes. Hatch brought it a bowl of water. It didn't move until the little one toddled over, laid a crust of cornbread before it, and whispered, "You can stay, if you're quiet." They called him Tatter. The days began to pass, slow and thick like honey from a cold jar. Hatch mended the fence. The girls sorted beans, making little piles by size and color. When a nail bent, the older girl would straighten it with a smooth hammerstone she'd found by the creek. When the stove coughed smoke, the little one would climb into Hatch's lap and stare at the flames, her eyes wide and unblinking. No one asked where they came from. No one asked what came before. It was a house holding its breath. But something shifted on the 7th evening. The older girl, looking for a lost button, found a box under the bed. It wasn't hidden. It was just resting there in the dark. She pulled it out. Inside there was a brush with long, dark hair still tangled in the bristles. A letter, folded and sealed, but never sent. And a ribbon, the exact same shade of sky blue as the coat that still hung by the door. She closed the lid slowly. She carried the box out to the porch where Hatch sat, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "I didn't break nothing," she said, holding it out. "But I saw what was in there." He held her gaze, his hands stilled. That was hers. I figured. He waited, his silence a question. "She's still here, isn't she?" the girl asked. "In some ways." She sat beside him on the step. "You can leave things behind and still love them." He set the half-finished bird aside. "I know." She looked up at the first stars pricking the dark velvet of the sky. "We won't stay forever," she said. "Maybe just long enough to mend." "That's enough," he said. The wind picked up then, whispering through the pine boards. Tatter lifted his head, gave a soft whine, then settled again. It felt like peace, but it was the kind of peace that comes before a storm. The very next morning, they rode to town. Hatch hitched the wagon in front of the dry goods store. He handed the older girl 2 coins and told her to get ribbon for her sister's hair and a sack of flour. She stared at the money in her palm as if it might burn her. The little one stayed in the wagon, her small hand clutching Tatter's bent ear. Inside the store, the air grew thick. Eyes followed the girl as she walked to the counter. A woman with a pinched face narrowed her eyes. "You're one of the ones from that event," she said, the word auction left unspoken, but hanging in the air. The girl didn't answer. She just slid the coins across the worn wood of the counter. The storekeeper weighed the flour, his movements slow and deliberate. "Rancher's got a kind heart," he said, not looking at her. "Taking in strays." The girl's face was a mask. "We ain't dogs," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The pinched-faced woman let out a bitter little chuckle. "Didn't say you were. But folks talk." "I know," the girl said, taking the sack of flour. "They always do." Back in the wagon, she didn't speak. Hatch looked at her, a question in his eyes, but she just stared straight ahead, her jaw set. That night, Hatch lit a lantern and opened a heavy leather-bound ledger he hadn't touched in years. He dipped a pen in ink and wrote 2 names into it. No surnames, just the first names, spelled as best he could remember them being spoken. Then he closed the book. Later, as he passed the girl's room, he heard the older one whispering to her sister in the dark. "If we're quiet," she was saying, "maybe they'll forget to hate us." The little one didn't answer, but her fingers reached across the blanket, found her sister's hand, and held on tight. Morning came, and with it, a rider. He wore a clean shirt and clean boots, but his eyes were hard. He wore the badge of a church elder and carried a paper envelope. Hatch met him at the gate. "There's been questions," the man said, his voice clipped and official. "About the girls, about you." "I figured," Hatch said. "Someone always answers for what ain't their business." The man hesitated, thrown off by Hatch's calm. "You planning to keep them?" Hatch didn't flinch. "Planning to feed them, keep 'em warm, teach 'em the names of the birds. That enough for now?" The man rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. As the sun began to set, the older girl sat on the porch, tying and untying knots in a piece of string. Hatch came and sat with her. "Do you think people can tell?" she asked, not looking at him. "When you're trying your best?" "Sometimes. And when they can't." He looked out at the horizon, where the sky was turning a bruised purple. "You keep trying anyway." The dogs snored at their feet. A single bright star blinked alive overhead. Inside, the little one was drawing on a plank of wood with a piece of charcoal from the stove. She drew 3 figures, 1 tall, 2 small. She drew a dog with a bent ear. She drew a house with a singing wind chime. She drew a big, smiling sun. She didn't show it to anyone. She just slid it under the bed, a secret treasure in the dark. But secrets in Marrowbone had a way of getting out. The gossip in town was thickening like cream left out in the sun. A woman from the church saw Hatch buying the girls new boots and ran straight to the pastor's wife. A man from the saloon claimed Hatch hadn't smiled in the 2 years since his wife died, but now he'd smiled once, watching the little one chase a butterfly, and maybe that meant something sinister. One afternoon, Hatch had to ride into town alone for horse feed. 2 older boys, sons of the pinched-faced woman from the store, followed the girls along the fence line. They threw stones, not at them, just near them. They called them names. Auction trash. Orphan mud. The older girl didn't cry. She just took her sister's hand, led her back inside, and locked the door. She sat with her back pressed against it, her body rigid, until the sound of Hatch's wagon returning sent a wave of relief through her. That night she asked him the question that had been sitting like a stone in her chest. "If they try to take us," she said, her voice shaking just a little, "what'll you do?" He didn't answer right away. He just took a long, slow breath and laid another log on the fire. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind chime on the porch caught a sudden gust and rang hard and frantic, like it had something urgent to say, but had no words to say it with. The girls slept light that night, their dreams filled with shadows. Hatch didn't sleep at all. Morning brought a brittle frost that coated the porch rails in a thin layer of silver. Tatter pawed at the door, then laid down with a soft groan. Hatch stirred the embers in the stove back to life. The older girl was braiding her sister's hair, her fingers moving with a gentle, practiced rhythm. Then she turned to Hatch, her expression serious. "I think she's starting to believe we're safe," she said. He nodded. She looked down at her own hands, twisting in her lap. "I ain't there yet." "I know," he said. "Takes time." She didn't move. "We never had a place that didn't want to trade us for something." He set down his coffee tin and looked her square in the eye. "No one here is for sale." She nodded slowly. "That's new." She rose, took the empty flour sack, and headed to the back room. Her steps weren't light, but they weren't as heavy as they had been. Hatch watched her go, a faint, unfamiliar lift in his own chest. He didn't notice the envelope tucked under the door until Tatter nosed it, growling low in his throat. It was sealed with a wax stamp, the church's colors. Inside was a summons. He read it twice. He didn't curse. He just folded it again, very precisely, and tucked it into the edge of the stove where no flame could touch it. But his eyes were like chips of flint. Then he looked down at the floor and saw the charcoal drawing. The little girl had left it out, maybe on purpose. He picked it up. He traced the tall stick figure that was supposed to be him. She had given him a smile, and beside it, in shaky, childish lines, were two words: "Our home." He stood still for a long, long time. Then he whispered something so soft the sleeping dog didn't even stir. Something that sounded like a prayer, or maybe a promise. The church bell hadn't rung for them, not the day they arrived, not on the Sundays that followed. It tolled for harvests and for weddings, for boys gone off to war, and for babies brought to be blessed. But for two orphan girls bought off a block, and for the quiet widower who carried them home in silence, the bell held its tongue. Marrowbone was the kind of town where silence carried farther than shouting. It was a place where more truth was spoken behind lace curtains than was ever said to a person's face. The ranch sat 3 miles out, but the whispers and the stares, they traveled fast. They came tucked inside sermons about moral duty. They curled in the corners of store ledgers, and they hid in the coughs of women who watched just a little too closely. On the porch, the autumn wind picked at Hatch's coat. He sat with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, his eyes on the two girls chasing Tatter through a pile of brittle fallen leaves. The youngest one laughed now. It was a high, breathy sound that still didn't quite trust itself. The older girl ran behind her, always watching, always near enough to catch her if she fell. It had been 3 weeks since the first letter from the church. 3 weeks since they had written their concern in neat, looping script and signed it at the bottom. Hatch hadn't responded. But in a town like Marrowbone, silence sends its own message. The visit came on a Monday. A buggy rolled slow up the dirt road, drawn by a dapple-gray mule with a crooked tail. 2 figures sat inside. Pastor Albaugh, a man with a long face and an even longer temper, and Mrs. Tabitha Gaines, whose bonnet brim looked sharp enough to cut a man if he looked at her wrong. She was holding the reins. Of course she was. The girls were inside, folding laundry. Hatch didn't call them out. "Mr. Hatch," the pastor said, as he stepped down, his voice trying for pleasant, but not quite making it. "We come peaceably." "Didn't hear no gunfire," Hatch replied, rising slowly from his chair. "May we sit?" Mrs. Gaines asked, her smile as tight as the seams on her gloves. "There's chairs," Hatch said, motioning to the porch. They sat. The dog didn't bark, but it didn't move either, just watched them from its spot by the door, a low rumble in its chest. The air was cold, with the kind of bite that promised snow was not far off. "Seems the town's curious," the pastor began, tugging at his stiff collar. "Curious about how 2 young girls came to be living under a widower's roof." Hatch didn't answer. He just watched a hawk circling high above the ridge. Mrs. Gaines cleared her throat, a sharp, impatient sound. We all know your reputation, of course, an honest man, a hard worker. But perception, Mr. Hatch, perception is its own kind of truth. They were being sold like cattle, Hatch said, his voice flat and even. I paid so they wouldn't be. No one is disputing your intentions, she said smoothly. It is the structure that is in question. Young girls are so impressionable. They sleep in the old room. The door stays open. I don't drink. I don't lay a hand on them. I feed them. I keep them warm. Is that enough? The pastor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It ought to be, but some think the girls belong with kin, or at the very least, in a registered placement, legally observed. Ain't no kin came forward for them on that block, Hatch said, his voice dropping an octave. And I don't need a piece of paper to know how to treat a child right. Mrs. Gaines opened her small purse and pulled out another envelope. Still, we have been asked by the board to deliver this. It is a request for a formal hearing. Not a threat, you understand. Just procedure. Hatch didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. I don't do well in rooms with gavels and men who think they know God's mind. Then you will have someone speak for you, she said, a hint of steel in her voice. Someone the town trusts. I don't need their trust. No, she replied, folding the envelope and tucking it back into her purse. But the girls might. The words sat there, heavy and cold, between them. Just then, the cabin door opened. The older girl stepped out, her arms full of shirts still warm from the stove. Her hair was braided neatly, the ends tied with a piece of sky-blue ribbon. Her eyes met Mrs. Gaines's, and for a long moment, she didn't flinch. I'll just put these away, she said softly, and disappeared back inside. Mrs. Gaines watched her go, a strange expression on her face. She's a clever one, she murmured. She's been through fire, Hatch said. That don't make you clever. That makes you iron, or it makes you ash. She's iron. They stayed a moment longer, accepted no coffee, and left without another word. The little bell on the buggy's harness clinked faintly as they rolled back down the road. That night the house was quiet again. Too quiet. The older girl stirred a pot of stew on the stove. Her sister sat on the floor beside Tatter, humming softly to herself as she tried to comb his fur with a wooden fork. They'll try to take us, the older girl said, not looking up from the pot. They'll try, Hatch agreed. She glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. Would you stop them? I'd stand in their way. That's not the same thing. He nodded once. The truth of that sat heavier than any denial could have. The stew bubbled. She ladled it carefully into 3 bowls, wiping the rim of his with her sleeve before setting it down in front of him. You got any folks? She asked. No one left. Why'd you pick us? I didn't, he said, his voice rough. You were already mine the second I saw you. She stilled, her spoon halfway to her mouth. The world seemed to stop for a second. Later, as the girls settled under their quilt, she whispered into the dark. He said I was already his. The little one yawned, a sleepy, contented sound. You're mine, too, she mumbled, already halfway to dreamland. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls like it was looking for a way in. 3 days passed. Then came Sunday. The church bell rang early, calling the righteous to their pews and the curious to their whispers. The girls wore dresses that didn't quite match. The older one's was a little too short, the hem brushing the tops of her knees. The younger one had a bow tied crookedly in her hair. Hatch wore his cleanest shirt, white with pale blue stripes. He left his hat behind. A hush fell over the pews when they walked in. Every eye followed them down the aisle. The air inside was thick with the smells of old wood, perfume, and judgment. Pastor Albaugh faltered for just a second as he saw them approach. They didn't go to the front. They sat in the very back pew, Hatch between them like a silent guardian. No one spoke to them, not during the singing of the hymn, not during the awkward handshake of peace. But the little one sang anyway. During Come Thou Fount, her voice rose, unsure but bright and clear. The older girl didn't sing. She just stared straight ahead, her chin held high. Afterward, in the churchyard, a woman bent down to pat the little girl's head. "Such a pretty child," she cooed, then turned to the older one. "But aren't you a handful? Look at that chin, like you're daring the world." "I am," the girl said plainly. The woman blinked, flustered. "Well, you'll learn some manners soon enough, I suppose." The girl didn't respond. As they were walking toward the wagon, a boy from the school, the son of the church elder, threw a stone that landed near their feet. Not at them, just near enough to be a warning. Hatch saw it. He didn't say a word. He just bent down, picked up the smooth gray stone, and slipped it into his pocket. That evening, the girls were quiet. Even Tatter lay still by the fire. As Hatch rose from the dinner table, the older girl asked the question that had been haunting her all day. "Will you send us away?" "No. But if they take us—" He turned and knelt beside her chair, so they were eye to eye. "Then we make enough noise they can't pretend not to hear it." She nodded slowly. "I could run. I'd find you. Would you bring us back?" "No," he said, and his voice was so soft she had to lean in to hear it. "I'd ask to come with you." Tears welled in her eyes then, bright and sudden, but they didn't fall. She blinked them back, hard. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something small. A locket, dented and scratched. She opened it to show him. There was no picture inside, just a dried sprig of something faintly green. "Mama used to say it was mint," she whispered. "She said it smells like safety." He didn't touch it. He just nodded. That night she placed the locket under her pillow, and for the first time since she could remember, she slept past dawn. The next morning brought another frost. The pastor came again, this time alone, on foot. "I've been thinking," he said, standing at the gate. "There's more than one kind of family." "There is." "I heard about the stone at church," the pastor said, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "I didn't throw it." "I know." The pastor sighed. "Do you want me to speak for you at the hearing?" "Won't change much." "Maybe not for them," he said. "But for the girls, it might help them to know someone said it out loud, that they matter." Hatch looked toward the house. He saw the curtain in the window shift, just slightly, as if someone had been watching and had quickly ducked away. "They're starting to believe it," Hatch said quietly. "That they matter." The pastor nodded. "Good. Then maybe the rest of this town will eventually catch up." When he left, Hatch found the gray stone in his pocket. It was smooth and cool to the touch. He placed it on the porch rail, right beside the little girl's collection of treasures, feathers and shiny pebbles and scraps of ribbon. That afternoon, the older girl painted it with berry juice, the color of courage. 3 nights later, a second letter came, delivered by the same boy who had thrown the stone. This one was shorter, colder. It said a date. Hatch sat at the table, holding the paper as if it might crumble to dust in his hands. The girls watched him, silent. "What's it say?" the older one finally asked. He folded it carefully. "It says we've got 2 weeks." "Until what?" "Until we have to stand in a room and answer questions from people who never bothered to ask what we've already lived through." The little one climbed into his lap and laid her head on his chest. He held her close, his hand stroking her hair, and said nothing. The wind chime outside clattered sharply, then went still. That night, as the moon cast long shadows across the floor, the older girl sat awake in her bed, clutching the locket tight in her hand. "I'd run," she whispered to her sleeping sister. The little one stirred. "Would he come?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Yes," the older girl said, "but I'd still run anyway." And in the hallway, Hatch paused, his hand on the doorframe, listening. He knew he had to find a way to hold them, not just in his house, but in a world that didn't want them. And for the first time, he felt a cold knot of fear that he might fail. But he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't fail quietly. The frost came early that year. It came in the night, whispering its arrival along the edge of the porch and sealing the seams of the windows with a delicate, icy lace. Hatch wrapped the chimney with burlap and tar, stuffed extra firewood near the hearth, and sat by the lamplight mending the quilts, the needle feeling stiff and clumsy in his calloused fingers. The girls grew quiet. Their laughter, which had just started to bloom, seemed to have been tucked away somewhere under the floorboards, where neither of them dared to reach for it. On the third night of the frost, the older girl stood by the window, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the world outside. "It's getting colder," she said, her voice a small puff of white in the dim light. "Maybe that'll keep them away." Hatch looked up from the stove where he was stirring a pot of beans. "They've weathered worse for less." She turned to him, her brows drawn together in a tight line. "They don't care that we're safe. They just care that we're not theirs. You're not anyone's to take." She didn't answer. She just kept watching the dark, as if it held the verdict she was so afraid of. The little one was restless. Her sleep was thin and full of soft, whimpering cries. She started chewing her nails again, a habit she hadn't had in weeks. Hatch caught her once, hiding beneath the table, her hands balled into fists in her skirt, whispering to herself. "If we're quiet," she was saying, "maybe we'll disappear." "No one's disappearing," he'd said, his voice gentle. She hadn't looked up. She just whispered, "Mama did." 2 days later, Hatch had to ride to town alone for winter supplies. He was gone longer than usual. The roads were getting slick. When he returned, the cabin was too still. There was no scent of stew hanging in the air, no rag dolls scattered across the floor. The fire in the stove was burning dangerously low, and Tatter was pacing in frantic circles, his tail twitching with anxiety. They were gone. He felt it like a physical blow. Outside, in the thin layer of frost that covered the ground, he saw their footprints. 2 sets of small tracks, heading not for the road, but for the dark tree line. They hadn't run. They had walked. Slow and deliberate, like 2 little ghosts slipping between the skeletal trees. Hatch didn't yell. He didn't curse. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. He simply saddled the mule, tied a heavy wool blanket behind the seat, and followed their trail into the woods. The frost made everything bright and cruel. Every snapped twig under his boots sounded like a gunshot. The silence of the forest wrapped tight around him, a question he couldn't yet bring himself to answer. After a mile, he found it. The little one's sky-blue ribbon, caught on the thorny branch of a hawthorn bush. It was trembling in the wind. He knew where they were going. To the old cedar grove, where a creek used to run in the spring. It was dry now, its bed lined with old stones and dead moss. And there they were, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, sheltered from the wind. The older girl had her arms wrapped around the younger, who was asleep, her thumb in her mouth, her cheeks bright red from the cold. The older one looked up when he arrived. Her eyes were wide, but she wasn't scared. She was defiant. He didn't ask why. He just dismounted, walked over and sat down beside them. He unrolled the blanket and draped it over their shoulders. The little one stirred, but she didn't wake. "I told her we should wait for a full moon," the older girl whispered, her voice hoarse. "But she said we had to go before someone came." "I figured you'd head this way," he said, his own voice quiet. "Close enough to be found, far enough to pretend you didn't want to be." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the frozen ground. "She heard someone in town say it again, that you bought us, that we were bought things." Her voice cracked on the last word. "She asked me if that made her like the cow in Mr. Henderson's pen. She was crying. She said she didn't want to be meat." His jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped. "You're not." "But we were." He didn't lie to her. He couldn't. He just sat with her in the cold, the truth a bitter thing between them. "She said she didn't want you to have to see her sold again," the girl added, her voice dropping even lower. "She said if she went far enough away, maybe you'd forget her." "I won't," he said softly. "Not now. Not ever." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Something raw and desperate flashed in her gaze. "If they come, and they say we don't belong with you, will you let us go? If they say you'll be in trouble for keeping us?" He didn't answer right away. He just reached out a hand and pressed it over the blanket, over her small bony shoulder. "If you go," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "I won't stop you, but I won't stay behind either." Her face crumpled. Not with fear, but with something deeper. A relief so big it was painful. "Do you mean it?" "I do." A single tear escaped and ran down her cheek. She wiped it away fast, as if it had betrayed a secret. They walked home slow, the little one asleep and warm in his arms. The older girl walked beside him, holding on to the reins of the mule. When they reached the cabin, Tatter barked twice, a sound of pure joy, then circled them before settling by the hearth with a contented sigh. Hatch laid the little one on the bed and tucked her in. When he turned around, the older girl was carefully folding the wool blanket and putting it back on the shelf. "You didn't yell," she said, her back to him. "No." "You didn't get mad?" "No." "Why not?" He leaned against the doorframe, his shoulders heavy. "Because leaving don't always mean betrayal. Sometimes it's just protection. Sometimes it's fear dressed up like strength. And sometimes it's just a question waiting for the right answer." She nodded, still not looking at him. "And you answered it." "I tried." Later that night, while the fire cracked and frost crept up the window panes, Hatch took out the heavy leather ledger. He opened it to the page with their names, and beneath them he wrote a single line, not a full sentence, just a phrase. "Stayed, even when she wanted to run." Then he closed the book. He didn't know that the older girl was standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching him. He didn't know she had seen the way he looked down at the page, his eyes soft, not like a man recording debts, but like someone holding proof of something sacred. She didn't say a word. But that night, before she crawled under the quilt, she crept over to his coat hanging by the door. She slid the sky blue ribbon she had found in the box, her ribbon, back into his pocket. And when he found it the next morning, he didn't say a word either. He just folded it gently, placed it in the small wooden drawer with his carving knife, and stepped outside. The frost was beginning to melt beneath a sunrise that was far too bright for all the things that had been left unsaid. And just then, the first snowflake of the year began to fall. Snow had begun to fall, not in heavy drifts, but in a soft, hesitant way, quiet and unsure, like a child asking for permission to stay. The wind carried it gently across the hills and along the edge of the porch, where the wind chime made of spoons and forks tapped out a rhythm like an old lullaby. Hatch listened to it, his hand curled around a warm cup of coffee, his boots resting heavy on the top step. The girls were inside, stringing popcorn and cranberries, their small hands moving with intense concentration, as if they were stitching together a reason to keep hoping. The hearing was 3 days away. He hadn't said much about it. Neither had they. But the silence between them had taken on a new shape. It was round and tender, but a little afraid at the corners. They moved carefully around one another, like people living in a house made of glass that had somehow, miraculously, learned how not to shatter. When the knock came, it wasn't the sharp, official rap they had been dreading. It was deliberate, thoughtful. 3 quiet raps on the door before it creaked open. It was the pastor again. He was alone this time, his hat in his hands, his eyes soft with a weariness that went beyond his years. "Snow's late this year," he said, stepping inside and shaking the flakes from his coat. "The frost tried to warn us," Hatch replied. "I've spoken to the board," the pastor said, his gaze moving around the small, warm room. "Some of them want formality. Some of them, I suspect, want blood. But a few of us just want to understand." The older girl appeared in the doorway to the back room, her arms crossed over her chest. "Understand what?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. The pastor looked at her, and his expression softened even more. "That this is more than sympathy," he replied gently. "That this is not just a lonely man trying to fix a wound he doesn't know how to name." Hatch moved to stand beside her, a silent, solid presence. "I never tried to fix them," he said. "I only tried to make sure no one else broke them again." The pastor looked around the cabin. He saw the fire crackling in the hearth. He saw the blanket, folded twice, over the arm of the chair. He saw the charcoal drawing of the stick figures and the dog, still pinned to the wall. It wasn't a grand place, but it breathed. It held warmth like a pair of cupped hands. He nodded once, a small, decisive movement. "Then I will say what I can." They said nothing as he left. The girl stood very still for a long time, as if she was unsure whether she had just been defended or dismissed. That night, Hatch pulled the girls' chairs closer to the table. They ate stew and warm cornbread. The little one, exhausted from the day's quiet tension, laid her head on his knee and fell asleep before her second bowl was even gone. The older girl didn't speak for a long time, just pushed the stew around in her bowl with her spoon. Then she looked up at him. "If they say no," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If they say we have to go, I won't stop them with my fists," he said. "I know, but I will stand between you and any shame they try to put on you, for as long as I can breathe." She looked at him, really looked at him, and her lip trembled. "I'm not scared for me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I'm scared for her. If they make her start over again, I think she'll just stop trying. She won't be alone again," he said, his voice a raw promise. "That, I swear." 2 days passed in a blur of falling snow. Then came the morning of the ride into town. The snow fell steadier now, blanketing the fence posts and rooftops in a thick layer of white. The wagon wheels groaned over the hidden ruts in the road. The older girl held her sister tight beneath a heavy quilt. Tatter ran behind them for as long as he could keep up, then stopped at the edge of the woods, his tail wagging a sad farewell. The courthouse was a cold, gray building. Inside, everything echoed. The sound of boots on the stone floor, the dry coughs of the assembled townspeople, the rustle of papers. A tall woman in a severe brown coat led them to a hard wooden bench at the front. Hatch didn't hold their hands, but he sat so close between them that their shoulders touched. He was their anchor in that cold, echoing room. When the 3 church elders entered, everyone stood. The pastor gave his testimony first, his voice resonating with a quiet conviction. Then, to everyone's surprise, the woman from the church, the one who had once narrowed her eyes at them, stood up. She cleared her throat nervously and spoke about how the girls were always clean, always respectful, and how the older one always made sure her little sister had the warmer spot by the stove in the general store. When it was Hatch's turn, he stood, but he didn't say much. "I didn't rescue them," he said, his voice clear and steady, his eyes on the elders. "I just gave them a place where they could rescue each other." And then something unexpected happened. The older girl stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she stood. "We're not just words on a piece of paper," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. "We're not just girls without people. We have him. We have each other. And if that's not a family, then maybe that word doesn't mean what you all think it means." No one interrupted her. No one dared. When they returned to the ranch, the snow had stopped. The sky was a clean, brilliant blue. The wind chime was singing its soft, metallic song. Inside, the first thing the little one did was run to the charcoal drawing on the wall. She picked up a small piece of charcoal from the hearth. She added a new figure to the drawing. A fourth stick figure, slightly shorter than the others, with a circle above its head. Then she stepped back, proud. "That's me," she said, her voice full of wonder. "But with a crown, because I'm safe now." And Hatch, the man who hadn't cried since the day he buried his wife, turned toward the fire and rubbed his eyes, pretending they'd caught some smoke. He didn't see the older girl rise from her chair. He didn't hear her walk across the room, but he felt it when she placed something small and cool into his hand. It was her locket. It was open. Inside, where the dried mint had been, there was now a new sprig, fresh and green and fragrant. And tucked beside it was a tiny folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a sketch of the cabin, drawn with the same shaky charcoal lines as the drawing on the wall. He looked down at it, then up at her. "We don't have a name for this yet," she said, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time. "But it feels like home." And outside, as the wind passed through the snow-laden pines, the chime whispered its agreement. Soft and true and enduring. This wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of a life. A life forged not from blood, but from bravery, from promises kept in the dark, and from the simple, profound truth that home isn't a place you're given, but a place you build together. If you believe that family is something you find, not just something you're born into, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And be sure to turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the next story we have for you. Ciao.